Mariah was carrying a tray full of coffee cups across the small cafe when she heard a sound that didn't belong to the lazy afternoon, a sharp, terrified scream that sliced through the warm air like a blade. She turned her head quickly and saw, through the wide glass window, two small children standing on the narrow, rusted edge of a fire escape on the building across the street, their tiny hands gripping the railing while their feet shuffled dangerously, close to nothing, and for one terrifying moment she thought they were playing. Until the boy's knees buckled and the girl's hand slipped from his, sending both of them tilting forward, their balance gone. Mariah didn't think, she just reacted, the tray falling from her hands with a crash, coffee spilling across the floor and splattering her apron, and she was already running out the door, her shoes hitting the pavement hard, the street strangely empty except for a lone newspaper drifting in the breeze, her heart pounding so loudly she could hear it in her ears as the children fell, their small bodies twisting in the air, their mouths open in silent fear, and she threw herself forward, arms out, every muscle in her body braced for the impact. That came like a shock, the weight of the two hitting her chest and knocking her backwards so that she landed on the hard ground with a cry, pain shooting up her spine, but she didn't let go. The twins clung to her, their breaths fast and shallow, their eyes wide and wet, and for a moment she just held them, feeling the wild hammering of their hearts against her, too stunned to speak, and the street was still silent, as if the world hadn't noticed what had just happened, the windows above empty, no one leaning out to call for help, no footsteps rushing toward them. Just the sound of her own uneven breathing and the faint whimper from the girl. Mariah looked up at the fire escape, the metal rattling slightly in the wind, wondering how they'd even gotten up there and where the adults were. Her thoughts a rush of questions she couldn't answer, but her arms stayed tight around them, because she could still feel the echo of that terrible second when they were falling. Finally, she shifted, asking in a soft voice if they were hurt, but neither spoke, their faces pale and frightened, the boy pressing his cheek into her shoulder as if hiding from something. And that was when she noticed movement across the street. A tall man in a gray coat, walking toward them with slow, steady steps, his face unreadable in the shadow of the brim of his hat, his hands in his pockets, and though Mariah thought he might break into a run to check on the children, he didn't, just kept coming with that measured pace that made her uneasy. She swallowed and adjusted her grip, her eyes fixed on him, the quiet around them stretching in a strange, heavy way, until he finally stopped in front of her, looking down at the twins without saying a word for a long moment, and then he crouched, his voice calm and low, as he said, "Thank you," lifting the children carefully from her arms as if they were something fragile. But even as he did, neither child looked at him, their eyes darting anywhere else, and Mariah opened her mouth to ask who he was, where he had been, what had happened. But before she could, he straightened, gave a single short nod, and turned away, walking back the way he had come. The children, held close against him, their faces hidden, leaving Mariah kneeling in the middle of the street with coffee stains on her apron, her arms aching from the rescue, and her mind caught on the strange stillness of the moment. The unanswered questions, settling in her chest like a weight she couldn't shake, and though she didn't know why, she felt certain she had just stepped into the middle of something far bigger than a simple accident. Mariah stayed kneeling on the pavement for a long moment after the man in the gray coat walked away, her breathing uneven as her mind tried to catch up with what had just happened, the sound of the children's faint whimpers still echoing in her ears, and when she finally stood, her knees ached from the impact of catching them. But it was the heaviness in her chest that kept her moving slowly back toward the cafe, where the smell of spilled coffee and the sight of broken cups on the floor felt strangely distant now, as if it belonged to another time entirely. She cleaned the mess without speaking, her coworker asking if she was all right, but she only nodded, unwilling to explain because she wasn't sure she could. And the rest of the day passed in a quiet blur until the late afternoon light faded into evening, bringing a cool wind that carried the scent of rain. Just before closing, the door creaked open, and she looked up, half expecting to see the man again, but it was only a couple coming in for coffee to go. Yet her heart didn't settle, a restless unease, whispering at the edges of her thoughts. And that night she found herself replaying the scene over and over, his slow walk toward her, the twins refusing to meet his gaze, his single word of thanks that somehow felt too short, too measured, as if it was covering something else, something heavier. The next morning she woke early, unable to shake the image of the children's small hands gripping the rusted fire escape, and she decided to take a different route to work, passing by the building where it had all happened. But there was nothing unusual there now, just a man smoking on the corner and the sound of a radio from an upstairs window, and she kept walking, telling herself it was over. Though her steps slowed when she reached the cafe door because part of her didn't believe it. That afternoon, as the place began to fill with the usual crowd, a regular customer named Walter, an older man with sharp eyes and a habit of noticing more than most, sat at the counter and studied her in a way that made her skin prickle. And, after a few moments, he leaned closer, lowering his voice so only she could hear. "You should be careful, Mariah, you've stepped into something you don't understand." And when she asked what he meant, He didn't answer right away, only tapped his fingers on the counter and glanced toward the door before saying, "Those twins, they belong to a man you don't want to cross," and his tone carried a weight that made her grip the edge of the counter a little tighter. She asked him again, this time more urgently, but Walter shook his head and muttered, "Some things are better left alone," before leaving his coffee half finished and walking out without looking back, leaving Mariah with more questions than before. That night, she couldn't sleep, the shadows in her small apartment feeling deeper than usual, the hum of the refrigerator too loud, and every creak of the floorboards upstairs making her think of footsteps that might stop outside her door, though she knew it was irrational. Still, when she finally did drift into an uneasy sleep, her dreams were filled with the image of the twins' faces, wide-eyed, silent, and holding something unspoken behind their fear and man's unreadable expression, a mask that revealed nothing but suggested too much. The following day passed without incident, but the unease lingered, and when the cafe was nearly empty in the evening, the air heavy with the scent of fresh cinnamon rolls from the bakery down the street, the door opened again, and this time, it was him, the tall man, the twins beside him, their small hands in his, their eyes flicking briefly toward her before darting away. He stopped at the counter, his voice calm and low, as he said, "They wanted to thank you properly," and the boy reached into a paper bag, pulling out a warm cinnamon roll wrapped in wax paper, the sweet smell rising between them, and Mariah felt her throat tighten as she accepted it, murmuring a quiet thank you in return. Though her eyes searched the man's face for answers she knew she wouldn't get, the girl offered her a faint, fleeting smile before leaning against the man's side, and for a moment there was a strange stillness between them, the hum of the coffee machine the only sound, until the man gave a small nod and turned to leave, the twins following close, and Mariah watched them go, the warm paper bag in her hands feeling heavier than it should, a knot of questions tightening inside her, and deep down she knew this wasn't just a simple thank you, this was the beginning of something, though she couldn't yet see what, and the uncertainty made her pulse quicken, in a way that was half fear, half something she couldn't name. Mariah stood behind the counter long after the man in the gray coat and the twins had gone, the cinnamon roll cooling in its paper bag on the counter, untouched, her eyes fixed on the door as if half expecting it to open again, though she knew it wouldn't. The cafe was quiet except for the low murmur of a couple in the corner and the occasional hiss from the coffee machine, but her thoughts were anything but still, circling around the way the twins wouldn't meet her eyes, the man's calm voice that seemed to hide more than it revealed, and the strange weight in the air whenever he was near. The next morning she decided not to eat the cinnamon roll but placed it on her small kitchen table, telling herself she would keep it as a reminder of the children's safety, though she suspected she was really keeping it because it felt like a piece of the mystery she couldn't let go. Later that day, the cafe was busy, the lunch rush bringing in the usual mix of office workers, students, and the old regulars who had been coming for years, and Mariah forced herself to smile and serve them as if nothing was wrong, but her mind stayed half elsewhere until Walter, the older man who had warned her before, walked in and took his usual seat at the counter, his eyes meeting hers with a look that told her he hadn't forgotten what they'd talked about. When she brought him his coffee, he spoke without preamble, his voice low and edged with something that made her lean closer. They were here again, weren't they? And when she hesitated, he didn't wait for her answer, continuing, "You need to be careful because once you're noticed, it's hard to be forgotten," his words making her skin prickle. She asked him what he meant, but he only glanced toward the door and said, "Some debts can't be repaid, Mariah, and some people don't like others stepping into their business." Then sipped his coffee as if he hadn't just unsettled her. Further, she wanted to press him, but before she could, another customer walked in, and by the time she turned back, Walter had already left, his empty cup sitting neatly on the counter, a few coins beside it. That night, alone in her apartment, she found herself pacing, the floor creaking under her feet as she tried to make sense of it all, to children almost falling to their deaths, a stranger appearing just in time to take them away, a warning from someone who seemed to know more than he'd say, and a lingering feeling that she was being watched. She pulled back the curtain to look out at the quiet street, seeing nothing unusual, but the shadows between the parked cars seemed deeper than normal, and she let the curtain fall quickly. Over the next few days, she noticed small things, people who came into the cafe but didn't order much, sitting alone and watching the street, a dark car idling across from the building in the evenings, and a man she didn't recognize standing at the corner one afternoon, glancing in through the window before walking away. She told herself it was all coincidence. Yet the tension in her shoulders wouldn't go away, and every time the door opened, her eyes flicked to it before she could stop herself. One rainy afternoon, the cafe was quieter than usual, the soft patter against the windows making the space feel smaller, and Mariah was wiping down the counter when a young woman she'd never seen before came in, her clothes damp from the weather and her hair clinging to her face, and ordered only tea. But instead of drinking it right away, she leaned in and asked softly, You're the one who caught them, aren't you? And when Mariah froze, the woman's lips pressed into a thin line as if she'd said too much. Then she added, "Be careful, because not everyone wants a hero," before leaving the tea untouched and walking out into the rain, disappearing down the street without looking back. Mariah stood there for a long time after, her hands gripping the counter, the words echoing in her mind, and she realized that whatever this was, she was now part of it, whether she wanted to be or not. And the unease that had been following her since that day outside the cafe settled in deeper, a cold weight that told her something was coming, and it wouldn't be simple, and it wouldn't be safe. The rain had stopped by the time evening fell, but the streets still glistened under the streetlights, the reflections of neon signs trembling in shallow puddles, and Mariah stood behind the counter of the cafe, wiping the same clean glass for far too long, her mind lost in the memory of the young woman's warning from earlier that week. The words "not everyone wants a hero" playing over in her head like a song she couldn't turn off. The cafe was nearly empty now, the hum of the fridge and the faint crackle of the old radio filling the silence. When the door creaked open and she looked up, her breath catching not because she was startled, but because she had known deep down it was only a matter of time before he came back. The man in the gray coat stepped inside, the twins with him, their small hands clasped tightly in his, as if they were afraid to let go, and though his expression was as calm as before, there was something in his eyes tonight, a flicker of urgency, or maybe unease, and it made the air between them feel heavier. They crossed the room without a word, the man stopping at the counter and setting the children gently in front of him, his voice quiet but steady as he said, "They wanted to see you again," and the boy nodded faintly while the girl kept her gaze on the floor. Mariah forced a small smile and asked how they were, but the only answer was the rustle of the man's coat as he reached into his pocket and pulled out a small folded piece of paper, sliding it toward her across the counter. Without explanation, she didn't unfold it immediately, aware that his eyes were watching her closely, and instead asked, "What is this?" But he didn't answer, only gave the smallest shake of his head before turning to the twins and saying, "Go pick a pastry," his tone softening in a way she hadn't heard before. The children moved toward the display case, their steps slow, and for a brief moment it was just Mariah and the man facing each other in the dim light, the paper between them like a silent question. Finally, she opened it, her eyes scanning the neat handwriting and address, a time, and nothing else. No name, no explanation, just a place on the other side of town she didn't know well, and the hour written in bold, as if it mattered more than anything. She looked up to ask him why, but he was already calling the twins back, each holding a small pastry in hand, and he told her, "If you come alone." Before turning toward the door, her pulse quickened, a part of her wanting to call after him, another part telling her not to, and she stayed silent as the door swung shut behind them, the faint jingle of the bell lingering in the air. She stared at the address for a long time after, memorizing it before tucking it into her apron pocket, and the rest of the night passed in a haze, every customer's voice muffled by the weight of what she had just been given. When closing time came, she locked the cafe with hands that felt unsteady, the street outside empty, except for the low hum of a passing car, and as she walked home, she kept glancing over her shoulder, half expecting to see the gray coat in the shadows, but the sidewalks were deserted. At her apartment, she laid the paper on the kitchen table and sat staring at it under the yellow light, wondering what could possibly wait for her at that address, why he wanted her to come alone, and whether it was curiosity or fear that kept her from tearing it up. By the time she went to bed, she still hadn't decided if she would go, but sleep didn't come easily, and when it did, it brought dreams of the twins on the fire escape again, only this time there was no one to catch them, and she woke with her heart racing, the morning light barely softening the unease that clung to her. The day felt longer than usual, her attention caught on every sound, every unfamiliar face, and by the time the hour on the paper was near, she found herself walking the streets toward the address almost without deciding to, her steps guided more by instinct than choice. The neighborhood grew quieter as she went, the buildings older, the lights dimmer, until she reached a narrow alley that matched the one described in the directions. At the end stood a small weathered door with no sign, no window, and she hesitated, her hand hovering before she finally knocked. It opened almost immediately, revealing the man in the gray coat, his expression unreadable but his eyes sharper than before. And behind him, in the dim room, she saw the twins sitting at a table, their faces turning toward her with something between relief and fear, and in that moment, Mariah understood without words that whatever this was, she had just crossed a line she couldn't step back from. Mariah stepped into the dimly lit room, the air carrying a faint scent of dust and something older, like forgotten papers, her eyes adjusting slowly to the warm glow of a single lamp on the table where the twins sat, their small hands folded together as if holding onto each other for strength, and the man in the gray coat closed the door behind her with a quiet click that seemed louder than it should have been. For a moment, no one spoke, the silence stretching, broken only by the sound of distant traffic muffled by the thick walls. and then he gestured for her to sit, his voice calm but carrying an edge she couldn't place as he said, "You're here, so you must want to know why." And though a part of her wasn't sure she did, she sat anyway, the chair cold beneath her as her hands rested uneasily in her lap. The twins' eyes flicked between them, the boy's expression guarded while the girl's gaze lingered on Mariah with something like trust, and she realized that, whatever had happened before, they saw her as someone safe, maybe the only one. And that thought tightened her chest. The man leaned forward, his hands clasped together, and began to speak in a low voice, telling her that the fall from the fire escape had not been an accident, that someone had been watching the children, waiting for a chance, and that her stepping in had not only saved their lives, but had changed the course of something he had been trying to control for months. Mariah listened, each word pulling her deeper into a world she didn't know existed, one where trust was currency and mistakes were dangerous. And though he never named who they were, she could feel the weight of the danger pressing in. From all sides, he paused, his eyes meeting hers, and said, "If you had not been there, they would be gone." The words blunt and heavy, and she realized then that his gratitude measured and quiet had been real, even if buried under layers of caution. She wanted to ask why the children had been left alone, why no one had called the police, why he hadn't told her sooner, but something in his face told her there were answers she wasn't ready to hear, and instead she asked, "What do you need from me?" And he leaned back, shaking his head slowly, saying, "Nothing. Except that you remember this night and understand that sometimes doing the right thing will place you in the path of things you can't undo." His voice carrying, not threat, but truth, and it made her skin prickle. The twins slid off their chairs then, coming to stand beside her, the boy slipping his small hand into hers while the girl rested her head lightly against her arm. And the man watched them with a look that was almost pain before he stood and moved to the door, opening it just enough for the cool night air to slip in. Mariah rose, still holding the boy's hand until he let go, and as she stepped past the man, he said one last thing, his voice low and certain, "You'll never see us again, but you'll know if we're safe." And she turned to look at him, wanting to ask how, but the door closed before she could speak. Outside, the street was quiet, the lamps casting long shadows on the cracked pavement, and she walked without knowing exactly where she was going, the events of the night layering over the memory of the day she had caught the twins, forming something she knew would never leave her. Back in her apartment, she placed the folded piece of paper with the address beside the untouched cinnamon roll, both now symbols of something unfinished yet complete in its own way. And she sat for a long time in the dim light, realizing that she would likely never know the full truth of who the man was, what had been chasing the children, or why fate had placed her on that street at that exact moment. But deep inside she understood that not all stories end with answers, some end with a choice, and hers had been to run toward falling children without thinking, and whatever unseen ripples that had caused, she could live with them. In the weeks that followed, she returned to the rhythm of the cafe, the clink of cups and hum of conversation filling her days. But every so often, she would glance toward the door when it opened, half expecting to see small faces she knew she wouldn't, and though they never came, she held on to the memory of their hands and hers, the silent bond they had shared, and the knowledge that in a world full of shadows, she had, for one brief and unplanned moment, been the light that caught them before they fell.